Hello, everyone. Welcome to Opinions New by Dr. Frank Tian Xie. I'm Frank. In this episode, I want to talk about a new terminology, a new term coined by the Chinese government called internal cycle of Chinese economy or internal cycling of Chinese economy. So what it is, right? What it means, what does it mean, and what's its implications. Basically, the whole thing started when I was interviewed by Mr. Lin Feng of VOA, Voice America. That's their Mandarin Chinese language division of the radio network, broadcasting network. Okay? During the interview, Mr. Lin asked me this question about, what do you think of the so-called huge domestic internal cycles of Chinese economy proposed by Xi Jinping, the Chinese communist leader. Okay? And basically, in the past, not too long ago, 2 weeks, a week or two or so ago, Mr. Xi actually had a meeting with Chinese entrepreneur, business people in Beijing, whereas he talked about they want to develop the Chinese government, communist government, wants to develop the Chinese economy based on a huge domestic internal cycle, right? And also depending on two cycles, actually, the internal domestic cycle and the external international cycle. And then to develop the Chinese economy so as to create a new framework, a new pattern of economic growth. Okay? And so why are they proposing this at this time? So she actually admitted that at this time in the world today, the protectionism is on the rise. Worldwide protectionism on the rise. The worldwide economy is in big trouble. It's going down, and also global market is shrinking. To China, to Chinese producers. And under such circumstance, China has to use its huge domestic market, potential domestic market potential to have a prosperous Chinese economy, and also to recover or rebuild Chinese economy. And hopefully they want to so-called unquote lead worldwide economic recovery. Unquote. Okay. That's what she was saying, and that's when under that condition she proposed this domestic internal cycle of Chinese economy. The news actually interviewed the former Chinese communist leader. And he actually said something like, "This is so-called internal cycle of Chinese economy is really nothing new. It's just the same old policy of Mao Zedong 50 years ago, when he said that we need to be self-reliant. Self-reliance proposed by Mao now reincarnated into this internal cycle of Chinese economy." And Mr. Lin asked me, "Do you agree with that?" I said, "Yes, I do. Actually, it is indeed a self-reliance, re-engineered. And also, this is just a reflection of a Chinese economy closed, command-style Chinese economy, like 40 years ago, right? Since China opened to the world in 1978. Okay? So what does she mean? What does she mean by saying that, proposing that concept? And what does it reflect? What's the meaning? What's the implication to Chinese economy and worldwide economy, or maybe even some impacts to the United States? Basically, the Chinese government, the communist government, admits that since the trade war with the U.S., the Chinese economy is really in big trouble, in really deep hot water. Right? And first, the worldwide market is closing on China. right? And also the world economy has suffered great deal from the CCP virus and Wuhan pandemic. Right? China is no longer the world factory as we know. Right? And many of the factories, manufacturers, companies, factories, plants in Pearl River Delta and the Yangtze River Delta of China are moving out of China, moving to outside of China, uh, to countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and Pakistan. Right? And of course, this mass exodus of manufacturers are spearheaded or actually pioneered by President Trump and the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, because they were the one to provide money to American and Japanese companies for them to relocate their factories back to Japan and the U.S. Right? So the government governments are even willing to pay for the relocation. Okay? So now back to the Chinese economy. Now the China is no longer holding or does not have the status as a world factory anymore. Right? The factories are closing down. Right? Now they have to rely on domestic, market. Right? In Chinese economy, in discussing Chinese economy, there is a term called three carriage, three carriage of Chinese economy. Or let's say, I'll say it's probably better to say three pillars of Chinese economy, right? Or the three pillars that constitutes the mainstay or the major part of Chinese economy, right? The three pillars are domestic consumption, right? Investment in infrastructures, and import export. Right? With import export, mostly export, uh, that section, that part of Chinese economy is no longer there because the U.S. is closing on China, closing up its market to China, and with the trade war, with tariffs from 5% up to 25% on 350 billion worth of U.S. products, yeah. And actually the $500 billion worth of U.S. products, right? And that is just not there anymore. And with that, the U.S. Chinese products are becoming less attractive to U.S. importers, and they just cannot sell that much. Right? The trade surplus China has enjoyed with the United States for decades, they're raking in like hundreds of billions of dollars every year. It's no longer there. Right? Now, with the import and export, one of the three pillars down, what about the other two? The other one of them is investment in infrastructures. China has been heavily relying on those investments in infrastructures in its economic development for the past several decades. Anyone who has been to China recently or in the past 10 years or so probably was very much impressed by the high-rise buildings, the highways, automobiles, and the high-speed rails. But there is actually overinvestment in those infrastructures, and there is a huge debt burden on the back of Chinese government, central government, and local governments. I'll take an example. You've seen those high-speed rails in China, right? Of the huge high-speed rail network in China, only two routes, right, uh, are profitable. Right, one from Beijing to Shanghai, the major two hubs, to which the largest two cities, most important cities in the country. Another one from Beijing to Shenzhen and then to Hong Kong. These are the only two that are profitable with the passengers and the traffic. Right? No others, they build so many of them. Right? There's a huge network. No others are not profitable. The ones that are going to from Beijing to northwestern part of China, you know, they can't even generate enough revenue from the passengers and to pay for their utility. the electricity bill. Okay? So can China, like China, still build more? Of course, they can try to build more, but then they have to print more money to do that, right? They're heavily in debt. The more money they print, the inflation will be hyperinflation will be a problem, a bigger problem. Okay? So that pillar is broken. The third pillar is domestic consumption, but that one is also not really working. Why? Because it's not like this country, a normal country like the United States, where we pay taxes, to the government. Government has a tax revenue and then spend on things like on public welfare, everything. Right? In China, the government took a much, big part, big chunk of this annual economic output by what? How? By state-owned enterprises. They control all the major, most profitable industries in the country, from banking, telecommunications, uh, energy, transportation, you name it. They're all owned, controlled by the Chinese Communist leaders, the elite. The elite actually controls everything. Right? They took much of the profit already, so the Chinese people are left with not so much money. Right? The income is low. The income growth is not as fast as that of inflation, and also people have to face because the three big mountains on their shoulders. The three big mountains with big heavy burdens on them: education, healthcare, education, health, and housing. They're so just too expensive. Housing prices in China is so ridiculous. In many cities, the prices housing is higher. The price is higher than that in New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles. It's ridiculous, right? So with the domestic market, this has never been a good thing or a shining spot in Chinese economy. Now with the pandemic, with the shift in supply chain, with unemployment, and the young people, they just don't have the jobs. They don't have the money and they don't have the income. They don't have the discretionary income that makes up, this domestic consumption, right? And also the government continues its way of doing things. They lie, they deceive, they cover up, and they never tell the truth. Right? Now the government of China, the Chinese Communist government, is recognized by the world community as a liar, as an authoritarian, dictatorship regime that's lying, lying, and lying. Okay? Now, beginning of July 31st, U.S. resumed the tariff on 55 categories of U.S. Chinese products. Now, the Chinese economy is even worse shape. Miss Lin asked me, Professor Xie, what do you think? Do you think the Chinese economy, the so-called internal cycle of Chinese economy, with that is that feasible? What is the limitations? Right? In my opinion, it's not feasible. It's not going to work. Okay? Because if you look at Chinese economy from 1978 or in the early 80s until today, it's really not the internal cycle of Chinese economy, but external cycle. Its trade, its openness to outside world, accessing U.S., European market, outside market. That, the export-driven economy, that actually bring the Chinese people to a better life, higher standard of living. Right? And that export-driven economy is also driving domestic employment, domestic market, and China relies heavily on international capital investment and technology and market and export to the outside world, especially to the United States. Right? Now, without this external or international cycle, without the input of technologies, either willingly or unwillingly transferred to China, and China cannot sustain. They cannot earn enough foreign exchange reserve. They don't export, they cannot earn enough foreign exchange reserve, and they cannot pay for the things they really need. That they have to things that they have to buy with the foreign exchange, with dollars, with euros, right? Things like what? Like energies, oil, right? Technologies, right? Medical equipment, key components to their high-speed rail train or train cars, and even engines for their cars, passenger cars, and for their airplanes, right? And because also China has been citing this stealing technology as is one of its national priorities because they rely on stealing technologies, so they don't really have the ability to develop those technologies by themselves. Now they have to steal, plagiarize, and do all the things to steal technology from United States. Right? Now the problem they have now, they're running short. They're running short on their cash, foreign exchange reserves, and they're not able to steal any technology from US anymore. Okay. Now, can China rely on itself? Can China adopt the policy of self-reliance? No, because in today's world, guess what? The whole world, all countries on earth are intertwined. Right? Any economy, you can't really, even pretend to be self-reliant. There's no such thing as internal cycling that's going to make a Chinese economy uh, viable. Okay, I'm going to give you an example here. There's so many things that China needs to buy from outside the world. They have to earn the hard currency to buy. Right? They cannot just buy without selling. Right? If they don't sell, they don't earn currency. Remember that currency, the Chinese currency, renminbi, RMB, is not freely exchangeable. They can't just because of that they have to rely on export to earn currency for hard currency like dollars, euros, Canadian dollars, etc. Right? And I'll give you an example. You heard about Huawei, right? Huawei, the cell phone and telecommunications equipment maker of China that's has ties to Chinese military and government, right? Huawei, can Huawei make its own chips for those cell phones? No, they cannot. Right? We're talking about microchips. The most advanced chips are made in U.S., Japan, and Taiwan. I heard the smallest they make nowadays is like 5 nanometers, 7 nanometers, 5 nanometers, and even 3 nanometers. You know what China is capable of making? They just said they're making 28 nanometers size the chips. Right? You cannot do that, right? If you keep making 28 nanometer chips, that's like if the chip's big, then your whole cell phone is must be big, right? Remember the first generation of cell phones that we had before, and if you're old enough, you saw that. I remember seeing one real estate agent having her cell phone, and it's about this long, this big, this thick. It's like a brick. She was actually holding a brick, like a cell phone, and the cell phone sits on another box, but this big. Is a battery, right? It was very advanced at that time. I was shocked to see that. This was I was in 1990s. Right? She took me to see some houses in Atlanta, and she took it her cell phone, huge brick in her hand, to call. Look at how this thing changed from just 20 years ago till today. Now we have a cell phone, this big, right? And but it's as powerful and more powerful than the personal computers we had, back those days. So China needs these technologies, needs the newest chips for its own telecommunications, cell phones, and other equipment. But they have to rely on external world. So they cannot just rely on internal cycling of this economy. Okay? Another question Mr. Lin asked me is that will this pandemic and also the trade war between U.S. and China. There is more and more demand domestically in the U.S. asking for decoupling between China and U.S. Now, at this critical moment, Xi Jinping is proposing this so-called internal cycle of Chinese economy. Would that accelerate the decoupling of the two countries, and China and U.S.? I think it would, but in fact, it's actually the trend or the pressure of decoupling that actually forcing China to seek so-called internal cycle of China economy. So they had to do this. They had to. You know? It has no choice. You know, from Chinese perspective, you're trying to ruling Chinese Communist Party. Of course, they don't want it. They don't want the so-called internal life cycle, internal cycle of Chinese economy. They don't want the decoupling, but they had no choice. They had no choice because the international community will not tolerate this, evil Chinese Communist regime anymore. Because this regime, the U.S. had paid too much money, given them too much money, nourished these evil forces for too long, too much for too long. Now this evil forces is so much bigger and so much stronger. It's really threatening the United States and the world. Okay? And finally, the Mr. Lin asked me about the BBC report, the report which says that the Xi's words or Xi's speech may mean that he's actually becoming not so aggressive. He's retracting from his aggressive stance. And now he's hoping that maybe the private sector in China can help the Chinese Communist Party so they can survive this crisis, right? And also they're trying hard to stimulate the China domestic consumption, domestic market, even try to ask people to encourage people to go buy those small private, small mini sized, businesses, even like what we call the stalls, and even what do you call those, like street vendors type of street vendor, mini small street vendor type of commerce, using that to help boost the economy. And that could be, I think that could be the case. They're trying. The regime is really struggling between the left and the right, between the Maoist section in the sector of the internal structure, is power structure, and also there is a sector that's more pro-American, more pro open economy of China, right? So, but the fight is always there between Chinese the two factions within the Chinese Communist leadership, and that's why they're doing things without a really fixed, steady vision and strategy, and that's going to fail. Okay? So that's all I want to talk about. This failing or not really promising at all internal cycle of Chinese economy. Don't look forward to it, right? That's all I have for this episode of Opinions New by Dr. Frank Tian Xie. I'll see you next time. Bye.